Hello and welcome back to AEF TV in association with Engerati. I'm now joined by David from Fasken Martineau, and for those of you who don't know, that's a law firm. David, firstly, welcome. Thank you for taking the time to be here. A little bit of a hospital pass, but you're here anyway. I'm sure we'll enjoy the conversation. One of the things I wanted to kind of say is that we're here in an environment where deals are being done. On large-scale deals, and my belief is that a barometer of whether these deals are actually happening is how busy people like you are. Just a soundbite question, how busy are you?
I'd look at that globally,
right.
Not necessarily busy on African power deals. You know, if you look at markets like the Middle East, Europe, South America, you know, the power market is picking up. In Africa, it's more sporadic. It's picking up in certain jurisdictions where there is clearly the administrative, political, or financial environment. You know, Kenya, South Africa, Morocco. I can't help but think the countries that really need power and need to develop their transmission capacity haven't got those because there isn't necessarily the administrative, political, or financial framework in place.
So we go back to this perennial question which keeps coming up, is that there is not a lack of capital out there, there's not a lack of will to put these things in. It always comes back down to that regulatory environment, that stability of infrastructure. And how do you see that progressing? I mean, is that just something that needs gestation? Is it just time?
It's the million-dollar question. You know, I've been coming to the AEF for several years, and that's the question that always comes up. How do you get projects funded? How do you get the right environment to develop projects? I think if you look at the markets where the IPPs are thriving, look at what they're doing right. Look at the markets where it's not thriving, look at what they're doing wrong. My sense is time is key. Rome wasn't built in a day. I think you've got to address the corruption issue. I think there's a capacity issue in terms of the technical skill sets to develop the projects in those countries, the administrative skill sets to run them, the ability of the utilities to run these large projects. I think you've got to look at tendering and procurement regimes. You know, if I'm an international power project developer, I don't want to go down a certain path, suddenly it gets pulled from me, and the mate of the president gets the job. It's all those sort of issues, and then that's before you even get into fully looking at the corruption issues and the political environment that you're doing these deals in. Look at the constant press about elections coming up. Elections seems to have two effects in whatever country. Either there's a sudden flurry to get projects done because an outgoing prime minister, president wants to leave a legacy, or everything grounds to a halt for 2, 3, 4 years in that run up.
And then that cycle just repeats itself, exactly. Because there's another thing.
I mean, I think sort of ways of breaking the cycle are far greater World Bank, IFC, African Development Bank participation, because with their involvement tends to come the sort of transparency constraints and the formal tendering process constraints, which should bring a level playing field to make it a bit easier for investors.
And it takes out some of that political element of it as well, because you can say, look, this is not necessarily, we have to do this.
Yes.
Because otherwise we aren't going to get these funds.
Exactly right.
And then you can have a different conversation.
Yeah. But even then you find certain nations in Africa bucking against the big multilaterals and the DFIs and pull back their desire for grants from those entities because they don't want that meddling in their tender processes and in their procurement processes.
And that comes back to a cultural side of things. If I can ask you as well, in terms of, I know you can't go into any specifics and things like that, but what would you say are some of the more sort of innovative power deals that you've seen out there? And this doesn't necessarily have to be in an African context. We can take a global context because there could be lessons to be learned from that.
Yeah, I think the Middle East is the real shining example, and you're seeing a lot of Middle Eastern developers looking to transport their Middle Eastern models into Africa. I think the key with the Middle East was they took a sort of pathfinder approach, whether it was some of the Emirates, whether it was Oman, whether it was Qatar. They'd get 1 or 2 projects off the ground, show the world they were bankable, work on the regulatory and the legal framework to get those deals off the ground. Once they were proven to the markets, then they became commoditized, and now they're just sort of rolled on a daily basis. There isn't a week that goes by, if you look at the trade press, the infrastructure magazines, the journals, where there isn't another IPP tender process being announced, there isn't another award being announced. And I think South Africa, you see they followed that model with their very successful renewables regime. In terms of the documentation from those Middle Eastern projects, I'm seeing that rolled out in Africa. Why reinvent the wheel when I've got a brilliant Middle Eastern PPA? I'll use that if I'm doing a deal in Mozambique, for example. So I think it's that sort of, I don't think there's any such thing as a true cookie cutter, but I think we can learn lessons from the Middle East, for example, with that sort of IPP model where you've got a utility procuring construction of a power project, and that power project will sell power to those utilities and will get the benefit of creditworthy guarantees, and that's where the lenders get happy, the equity gets happy.
And with those then as well, are you seeing that it seems to me that there's a lot of talk about this sort of IPP model. You mentioned South Africa, it's happening in Kenya and so on. Is that almost the de facto route that power projects are going to go down?
I think you have to do that until you've got a mature market, and then you can go a more merchant, shall we say, where you've got a mature power market, a mature grid system, a mature balancing system, which will allow you to generate and sell into the grid, and you will get a market set price. None of the countries in Africa are necessarily there yet for a variety of reasons. I think that means you have to look at projects essentially on a standalone IPP basis, albeit ideally in a commoditized market where you'll do project A, project B, and project C, and so on.
And then you end up with this sort of production line, and the learning of each one stacks on top of the other one.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I'm holding the Middle East out as an example, and that's exactly what's happened there. And it drives the cost of power down, most importantly. And the aim here is we're trying to produce cheap power for the good people of Africa.
And when you then look at some of the other things that are happening, where and if I can ask you to take a different role, because you're in this market, so you see it all the time. Last year there was this big buzz around renewables, and everything's going to be renewables, and people were using terms like, "Oh, Africa can leapfrog the power side of things." What's your view when people make statements like that?
I think it's an easy statement to make when you look at the availability of the renewable resources: sun, wind, hydro, even biomass or waste. The bottlenecks come back to the capacity, the political, the administrative, the physical, the grid capacity. Some of the places in Nigeria, for example, where it's wonderfully windy or wonderfully sunny, there is no sensible grid network there. So I could build a 30 megawatt solar power project in the sunniest spot. What do I do with the power?
Yeah.
Which is what is leading to an awful lot of focus on the off-grid solutions, which seems to be a particular theme at this year's conference.
And that whole off-grid, microgrid type of thing is kind of happening in other places. I mean, I have a sense that, I'm not saying it's not viable, but I feel like there's also needs to be a greater emphasis on this transmission and distribution infrastructure. And it's also a lesson you can learn from a place like Germany with the Energiewende and things like that. Whacking great big wind farms in the north, but the industrial is in the south. And even in a country like that, the political will to build the sensible transmission line isn't necessarily there.
It's a tricky one, isn't it? I think politically and economically, one often goes for quick fixes, and renewables with a sort of local mini grid is a quick fix compared with spending billions on a transmission network. If you look at a country like Mozambique, which has got that split north and south arrangement, trying to fix that will cost billions. If you look at the Inga 3 power project, which is looking to generate power and then wheel it down to South Africa, one of the big log jams there will be the transmission network through, I think it's about 3 or 4 countries. So you've got political and treaty issues, and then you've actually got the cost of developing the thing. And then there's the technology, that's changing all the time. The Chinese are looking at DC technology, which should be easier to ship power than the sort of the old AC.
Well, they've just
technology.
built a whole DC transmission line.
And that's one of the things that Engerati is looking at, for example. The costs are immense, so it's who's going to fund that. investors want a quick fix, lenders want relatively plain vanilla projects, so they're comfortable with the risks.
The skills as well.
Yeah. So who's going to take the risks of that cost, that size?
And just as we're coming to the end of our time here, I'd like to ask you one question. It's like, it's early days, so AEF has just started, and you mentioned you've been coming here for 6 years. What are some of the things that you're hoping to get out of the event this year?
I'd like to see. I'd
yeah.
like to see us move on from the moaning about lack of seed capital and startup capital. I'd like to see us move on from all the moaning about country A wants new IPPs but won't give guarantees for that electricity. They've got to do some work to make that a mature market so that investors are happy. And I would like to see more focus on the mini grids and the renewable solutions. And those mini grids don't even need to just be renewable. They can be hydrocarbon fueled or solar diesel hybrids. I think there is scope for that. And one of the things I'd like to see happening, and I allude to this in the talk I'm giving later, is look at mini grids that can be developed so as the state grid expands,
they can be connected.
It can be absorbed and connected. And I think that's one of the ways forward. And you can essentially build up your national transmission system on a modular basis, and I think there's a lot of scope for that.
Well, there's precedent for that. I mean, we covered the NICE grid by Alstom and down in Nice. It is actually the NICE grid. I've had this conversation with them. It's not the Nice grid, but it's the NICE grid project, and they've got all this islanding and stuff like that. So technically, it's possible, and it makes a lot of sense that you can very quickly put in power, and then when the transmission line goes past, hook it up. It's not as simple as that, but
But it's done incrementally, instead of having to come up with the billions of upfront costs to develop a 1,000-kilometre transmission network.
And that's great to hear, and I hope your talk later on goes well. I wanted to thank you for joining us. I'd like to thank you for watching this as well. Many more interviews to come on AEF TV in association with Engerati, but thank you for watching this one.
Thank you.